what happened to Western values, because it's a very interesting and important and strange story in a way, and it's worth reflecting on. The values that we heard about both Buddhist and Confucian thought clearly find some resonance in Christian thought, especially in gospel teachings of Jesus, and also in Greek thought, because if you look at Aristotle's philosophy, as was seen, you would find some connections that are quite important, actually, and I want to draw them out. But then Western philosophy took an odd turn, or Western thinking took an odd turn, and it's important to understand that change of values that took place starting around 1500 to today, because there really was a change of the Western philosophical approach and a divergence that is, I think, quite harmful in many ways. So if you look at Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius, if I might, just very briefly, they're all in deep ways, not the same ways, but deep ways, variants of what can be called virtue ethics. The idea of virtue ethics is that human beings have the potential to do good, not the inevitability of doing good, and that virtues need to be cultivated to bring out the best in human beings. And this is a common idea of Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius in the teachings. In Buddha's Eightfold Noble Path, there is the idea of the right view, the right action, the right speech, the right livelihood, and so on, as ways to cultivate the underlying virtues. Aristotle was very, very clear that happiness depends on virtue, but virtue must be cultivated. It cannot be taken for granted. And the main virtues in the Greek thought were virtues of what's called practical wisdom, or phronesis, which was the ability to choose the good over the enticing; temperance, which is moderation, which is a common virtue across all of these philosophies; bravery, which means the ability to defend the good; and justice, the ability to discern the right allocation for each person. And so those became the cardinal virtues in Western thought. But what was key for Aristotle was the idea that being virtuous is a potential of human beings, not an inevitability, because we are all bound by our bodily temptations, by our animal instincts, but also by our reason. So in Western Greek thought, reason was the predominant notion. This is not the same as in Eastern thought, but it comes to some similar points. And Aristotle said one must develop the habits of virtue. In fact, virtue or ethics comes from the word habit in Greek, that you practice, just as we heard, that you become altruistic by practicing altruistic acts. And Aristotle believed in mentorship, in education, in practice, in life experience as being vital. So here is a common basis that merges East and West virtue traditions at a quite deep level. And Christian thought, especially the teachings of Jesus himself as in the Gospels, are not the same basis. It's not exactly virtue ethics, but it is, of course, the virtues that are proposed, and especially also the Confucian golden rule is also Jesus's golden rule, although Jesus states it positively: do to others what you would have them do to you, and love thy neighbor as you love yourself. And that led in the early centuries of Christianity to a tremendous institutional focus of the bishops and the monasteries to care for the poor. And that was a real point, because the Christian communities, the emperors took care of their business and the bishops took care of the poor in a division of responsibility that started around the 4th century AD in the West. Skipping ahead 1,000 years, philosophy changed starting around 1500 in a rather deep way. And while Aristotle taught, for example, that politics is a field of ethics, and Aristotle's book, The Politics, which is the first book of Western political thought, no, let me say it's the first book of Western political science is the better way to say it, because Plato had written the Republic a generation earlier. But it's the first book of political science. It is paired with his ethics, Nicomachean Ethics, as two joined volumes, because for Aristotle, ethics and politics were the same. Of course, in 1514, I think it is, Machiavelli wrote a very different political science. He wrote a handbook for the prince, which was about how to maintain power. And political science in the West began to be the science of maintaining or managing power, not the science of producing the good. And in fact, Machiavelli was teaching the prince. He was actually making a job application back to the Medicis because he had been dismissed from the Medicis, wanting a job back that he was advising the Medicis how to hold power in Florence. Later, in the next century, one of the most influential texts in Western cultural history was written by Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. And this was written in 1640 as Western science was taking shape. And Hobbes wanted a scientific theory of human beings, but modeled as individual atoms that collide with each other. Because for Hobbes, there was no longer a cultivation of virtue, but rather each individual with insatiable desires. So Hobbes's model of human nature is that it is simply unbounded desire. It can't be taught to moderate desire. It can't be cultivated for virtue. It is individualistic and it is insatiable. And so Hobbes said, unless there is an overarching power, people will kill each other. And so we need a Leviathan, he said, to stop human nature from committing non-stop violence. It was a very pessimistic view of human nature, but notice the main point is no longer was there any idea of developing virtue. That was deemed to be impossible. Instead, one needed institutions to reflect harsh reality. This is the flip of philosophy. It's no longer about cultivating the good. It is about controlling the bad. Then interestingly and importantly, this was amplified at the beginning of the 18th century, first by a very influential public intellectual, Bernard Mandeville, who wrote an essay in London called The Fable of the Bees. And in The Fable of the Bees, the most aggressive bees win, but they make the hive powerful and great. And if you try to control the avarice or the vice or the aggression of the bees, the hive actually dies. So this was now a philosophy of empire, that power seeking was good because it would make the society powerful and wealthy and able to dominate over the other bees. So it was taking Hobbes and adding another element, one beehive taking dominance over others. And clearly this was a philosophy that appealed to the emerging British Empire. Then came Adam Smith 6 decades later in 1776, and he said, in agreement with Hobbes and in agreement with Mandeville, that human nature is individualistic, tastes are unbounded, desire is a great motivator, but market forces will tame all of that, because market forces will force a kind of competition that will lead to a socially beneficent outcome. The point is, the Anglo-Saxon philosophy broke free of more than 1,800 years of Western tradition. The Western tradition from Aristotle and Christianity was a tradition of the common good, virtue, and care for the poor. With the rise of the British Empire, the philosophy became the benefits of power as a philosophy. And then even the idea that this would lead to, quote, the common good. But there are two more steps that are important to state. The poor became an enemy because now they were a drag on society. So John Locke, one of our most esteemed philosophers, wanted very harsh treatment for the poor so that they would not be burdens on society. And then came Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote after Adam Smith, one generation later in 1798. And he proposed something even darker, which is that those hives, those different societies, are actually in competition for survival with each other, because there are more people produced than can be supported. And so life is a battle for survival, and trying to help the poor is inevitably to fail, because there will just be more poor people. That was his iron law of population. And that led in the next step. Darwin took that idea brilliantly from a scientific point of view to understand natural selection. But the later 19th century philosophers took that idea as a struggle across nations, and that now nations or peoples or races were in the struggle for survival. And this became known as social Darwinism. And the idea was, not only should there be no beneficence, if you help your own poor, you will weaken your society compared to others, and indeed you're in a struggle for survival. And this gave rise to the worst crimes of history, because Nazism actually, as a philosophy, which it was based on social Darwinist pseudoscience. And this idea the German people will survive or the Slavic people will survive. And so this is a war even to extermination. Now, this kind of idea led to the worst cruelties, but we are still in a mindset in the Western world where it is competition and struggle that is the absolute underpinning of society. When I studied economics, I was taught about perfect competition. I was never taught even 1 minute about perfect cooperation. The idea doesn't even exist in economics. It's not even developed in one paper that I know of, because the idea of cooperation as a norm doesn't exist. It happened, this notion of letting greed motivate action perhaps did generate the spirit of innovation to some extent. But the way that it was championed and taught, of course, led to the worst excesses. So the world became rich, and those who were rich became devoid of benevolence and compassion. And a terrible writer in the United States who became quite popular, Ayn Rand, a kind of popular philosopher among young people and among many politicians, wrote a famous essay about the virtues of selfishness. So selfishness became the virtue, actually. That's the literal title of an essay. It's unbelievable, and she is championed by many still. These novels are unbearable to read, but they are part of our philosophy. So I went on too long, I know, because the sign told me to stop 5 minutes ago. But so that's not very benevolent of me. But let me say the following. I believe we've had a deviation from the right path in Western civilization. There are roots of Western culture that we can really use to find a path of virtue and politics that is ethical. But the Anglo-Saxon version deeply lost this tradition. And there are many fascinating reasons for this, but it was mainly the rise of power of the British Empire, which was in many ways an extremely nasty empire. And the United States learned everything it knows from the British Empire because it aims to be the continuation of the British Empire after World War II. And this is what needs to end, a world that can return to the common ethical principles of virtue. Now, let me just conclude by saying I am hopeful that this can actually happen. And I think you at the table need to help lead that. And we need to help explain these things. And when President Xi Jinping launched last year the Global Civilizations Initiative, I think that this is actually an important opening that is very positive, because China has said we should go back to our roots of culture to find a way forward, which I very much subscribe to. And the GCI, or Global Civilizations Initiative, is an invitation across civilizational wisdom. And I hosted a meeting in Athens last month, co-hosted with the Academy of Athens, a Aristotle-Confucius symposium on ancient wisdom for modern challenges that brought together Chinese and Western philosophers. We didn't have Buddha properly at the table except one very distinguished Buddhist thinker from Cambodia, but we need more of that. At the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would have a second symposium. This time, I hope it is the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium in Shufu, in Shandong province in July. I hope we could participate together in that. We will be back for that. Many philosophers are interested in that. I will be in Shufu in next month for the Nishan Forum, which is also a philosophical forum, but the Shandong government has asked to host the follow-up meeting of the Aristotle Buddha Confucius Symposium. And I believe that this idea of East and West deep philosophical traditions, finding the deep humanity that is common across them, is extremely important and powerful and can really contribute to an understanding which right now doesn't exist. And I think the failings of this understanding are overwhelmingly on the Western side, if I may say so, because we are steeped in a philosophy of competition and even war. And this mindset is taken as given, but it is actually a recent phenomenon. It is an imperial phenomenon, and it needs to be put aside. So I believe that this actually can be done. Can I have 2 more minutes? Because I want to talk about net zero by 2050. And first to say how much I admire what Dr. Shaw proposed, and is the book in English also, or in Chinese? Okay, we're going to have to get me an English translation somehow, if we can, but I'm very eager also to read your forthcoming paper. Let me add a couple of things that I think are central, but I think they're already exactly in your climate club idea. It is not possible to reach net zero one country at a time, least of all for an island. We need an interconnected energy system, region by region, because if you are tapping renewable energy, it's intermittent. So it's sunny here or windy here. This needs interconnection. And East Asia should be interconnected in a common grid. There is a mainland China program called GuideCo, Cooperation Organization, that is the China State Grid engineers who are doing analytical work on interconnecting regional grids for Africa, for South America, for North America, for Europe, and for Asia. This is very important work. Taiwan should be connected to the mainland in a power grid. And the mainland should be connected with Mongolia, and it should be connected with the ASEAN countries, and with submarine system. It would be region, the economic powerhouse of the world, rather than a battleground, because this region has everything if it works together. and it could lose everything if it views the region as a battleground. I think everyone in this region can understand this. The only one that does not is my country, actually. But the U.S. needs to be told, let us solve our problems. We know how to discuss. Don't meddle, because you will make a mess. This is actually the truth. This is true about Japan. It's true of zero carbon energy and all the cooperation that would the regional cooperation, the regional structure, and pose and probably roadmaps that show the physical interconnectedness, what technologies, where, as I've been saying, opposite of a plan. It's 80% fossil fuel. What plan is that? Nothing. Please, don't encourage them. So show fantastic work. Sonia and I were just in Beijing with them a couple of days ago. We'll come back for a meeting that they're hosting on September 26th for a worldwide meeting on energy interconnections. I think that this is really absolutely at the core. So I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's absolutely the way forward. And in that polycentric world, there's a concept which I find very useful. It's a concept adopted by the European Union, but a concept that actually started with the Roman Catholic Church, and that is the concept of subsidiarity, which is that we need governance at all levels. So we need global governance, regional governance, national governance, local governance. You put each problem at the lowest level possible, closest to the people, where it can be solved, but not below the level at which it can be solved. So the power grid cannot be solved at the national level. It must be solved at the regional level. The targets for decarbonization must be solved at the global level, and so forth. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we have this multiple levels. We have global governance. We have a global government that can do certain things and not other things. We have regional government. We have national government. We have local.
Is there any hope that the U.S. and Ukraine are going to be trying to negotiate for some sort of peace agreement with Russia?
This is, Kim, not unlike the virus story in that the government lies relentlessly about why we are in this war, what's happening in the war, and therefore what is going to happen. The biggest lie is where this war came from. And I have a view that is deeply founded, I'm going to say, because I know a lot about this over the past 30 years. This is a war, in my view, that arose because the US rather pig-headedly, in other words, relentlessly, stubbornly insisted on pushing NATO farther to the east every step of the way. And the Russians kept saying, don't expand NATO towards us. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that to Ukraine. We don't want your military on our border. Do you get it? And the United States said, what? We don't hear you. No, don't worry. We're peace loving. We love you. We want to destroy you. We want to decolonize you. We want to break you up. We want to do all sorts, but we love you. And we never go to war except in bombing Belgrade for 7 straight weeks. And oh yeah, and Afghanistan we occupied for 15 years as NATO, and the Iraq War was unprovoked, and yeah, we tried to overthrow your ally Assad with the CIA regime change operation, and oh yeah, NATO took out Gaddafi, and yeah, we are placing missiles nearby you in Poland and Romania because we unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty, but we're peace-loving, and of course we're going to move NATO right up to your 2,300-kilometer border, and not just in Ukraine, but we're going to do it in Georgia. Fascinating, by the way. People, please take out a map and look up Georgia, not the one next to Florida, but Georgia in the Black Sea, on the eastern boundary of the Black Sea, because that country is not a North Atlantic country. So why would it ever be in NATO? And yet the United States wants to push NATO to Georgia. And if you look at a map, I can explain in 30 seconds why that is, because the intention of the United States is to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia creates an encirclement. And Russia's naval fleet, the Black Sea Warm Water Naval Fleet, is in Sevastopol, Crimea. And it's been there, by the way, since 1783. And there was already one major war in the 19th century between 1853 and 1856, where the British had the idea, get rid of that naval fleet. And in the late 20th century, Zbigniew Brzezinski had the same idea of surround Russia by getting Ukraine into the Western camp and actually into NATO. And then Russia ceases to be a major power, is their theory. Well, to make a long story short, this is the major reason for this war, and we've never been told the truth about it. And that is really devastating. Second, closely related issue is that in February 2014, the US conspired to overthrow the government of Ukraine. And it did so. That's not a good move. If you're trying to push NATO and there's a president named Viktor Yanukovych who wanted neutrality, and you get together with forces inside the country and you support the overthrow of Yanukovych, the violent overthrow, not a good look. That's when this war started in February 2014. And then if you look at the real sequence of events, not the mind-deadening repeated mantra of the US government and the New York Times and blah, 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 that this is an unprovoked attack that started in February 2021, 2022, excuse me, which is a nonsense. This isn't an unprovoked attack, and it didn't start then, it started in 2014. But in 2019 onward, the US poured in armaments to build up a very, very powerful army. And when Biden came in, he doubled down on this whole thing, because Biden and his team, Sullivan, Blinken, Nuland, have been part of this story since 2014, and really before, because Biden's always been an advocate of NATO enlargement. Biden's got some dark side still to be explained about Ukraine as well, because of Hunter's involvement. We don't know what that is yet, but there's something not good at all about that. But I think Nuland has been on this case of NATO enlargement. She was actually the ambassador under Bush Jr. in 2008 to where? To NATO. In the 2008 meeting, when the U.S. pushed the proposition and forced everyone to agree that Ukraine would become a member of NATO. So Nuland's been part of this story from way back when, from the Cheney Bush days, and she continued through the Obama administration days as the point person for the overthrow of Yanukovych in the US government and for the NATO enlargement issues. And then we started arming Ukraine heavily, especially in the late 2010s. And then Biden really doubled down when he became president and repeated actually in several high-level processes that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And to bring us to today, and just to conclude, on December 17th, 2021, President Putin tabled a Russia-NATO security agreement in a draft based on no more NATO enlargement. And I happened to call the White House after that and said, avoid a war, negotiate. It's not even a concession. Why do we want NATO in Ukraine? It's going to provoke disaster. And I was told, oh, don't worry about it, Professor Sachs, but we'll never negotiate over NATO enlargement. It's none of Russia's business. And I said, none of Russia's business? Are you kidding? It's their border, 2,300 kilometers. How can it not be their business where the American military alliance is? But we are so arrogant that we treated it as if don't have to talk to Russia about it. Then as soon as this special military operation was launched in February 2022, Zelensky said, okay, we could be neutral. And they actually exchanged documents, drafts, and negotiated a peace arrangement a year and a half ago in March 2022. And I talked to the negotiators, by the way. I talked to the mediators, the Turkish government, in detail. And you know what happened? The United States came in and told Zelensky, no, you don't agree to neutrality. You fight on. We have your back. You're going to win. You defeat Russia. Okay, now there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. This counteroffensive of June, July, August, and September is a killing field. Ukraine doesn't have the weapons, the manpower, the training, the air cover, the artillery to do this, even if it were desirable to do. They don't have it, so they're getting smashed. And Biden doesn't have the gumption to say, you know, this was a terrible blunder. We need to agree that NATO won't enlarge and save Ukraine, but rather, oh, we're all with you for as long as it takes, meaning how many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead as long as it takes? Oh, come on, I'm 68 years old. I know what it means as long as it takes. It means some moment the U.S. leaves. That's what it means as long as it takes. With a lot of dead in Ukraine, in a country that has been absolutely pummeled by artillery nonstop, basically, on both sides since February 2022, but with a lot of shooting and killing that took place since February 2014. This is terrible. This is destroying Ukraine. This isn't protecting Ukraine. And so this is the real story. But again, the government lies to us. We don't get to debate it. And if you say it, you know, you're a Putin propagandist, you're called. But I have written an op-ed in the last couple of days that I've put online where the Secretary General of NATO himself, someone I know quite well for a long time, Jens Stoltenberg, said when he was speaking in the European Parliament that Putin went to war to stop NATO enlargement. But we don't have to negotiate with him. Well, great favor to Ukraine.
It's interesting. I'm just looking at this map from what you're saying, and yeah, NATO has successfully, nearly successfully, completely cut Russia off from various bodies of water. I mean, you've got the Black Sea, what you're mentioning, and if they could get Georgia and the rest of Ukraine, and then they'll have every other area around that Black Sea, the Baltic Sea as well. They've cut them off from the Baltic Sea with Finland.
These are choke points.
Yeah, right. Why do you think they're trying to do that? Why cut them off from the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea? I'm curious if the Caspian Sea is next. I mean, is that what you think they're going to go after that one as well?
Look, I don't know if you have used to play Risk. Do you know that board game?
Yeah.
It was a board game of my youth. The idea was to have your piece on every part of the world map. Then you had taken over the world. Well, that's the neocon vision. They're playing Risk at the expense of vast numbers of deaths in many parts of the world. They want to have the U.S. military or subservient governments or supplicant governments or pliant governments everywhere on the map of the world. And this is pretty relentless. And it's kind of manifest destiny writ at the global scale. It used to be at the continental scale. Nothing can stop us. We take over all of North America. Native Americans notwithstanding, and so forth. This is manifest destiny at the global level. The only problem is others don't quite share this idea, and we are getting into an awful lot of wars, and they're very dangerous, very dangerous. This is a war with a nuclear superpower, and obviously a very powerful military. And Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads. And they're gunning after China, at least a lot of politicians in Washington. I think in the last few weeks, Biden is trying to pull back a little bit, I think, from the brink, but scared always of his right flank that he'll be attacked for being soft on China and so forth. But there are a lot of hardliners on China that seem really to be preparing for war. Can you imagine anything more reckless, stupid, unnecessary, potentially Armageddon than that? I can't. So all of this is mind-boggling to me. But the basic answer to your question is no rational reason other than that they think they're playing global hegemon and they need their piece on every part of the map.
Well, let me just say the kinds of things that should be done, in my opinion, are things like the Belt and Road Initiative of China, because the Chinese government recognized that for China's own well-being, but also the well-being of its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, and so forth, and countries even farther afield, all economies need modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure means access to high quality electricity, especially zero carbon energy now, to fast rail, to fiber, 5G networks, and so forth. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which is in its 10th year, uses especially finance from China, from the China Development Bank and other institutions, to help finance the spread of infrastructure across Eurasia and across the sea routes, also connecting Africa and South America and East Asia. So that's a very good example. It's pragmatic, it's investment oriented, it doesn't just talk the talk, it actually provides the financing and provides the technology. I wish the rich countries in the West were doing this. They are the former colonial powers. They behaved badly when they were the colonial powers, and they're not behaving very well as the post-colonial
Right.
powers. They're not really stepping up to their responsibility.
Right, because I was just in China like for 2 months, and I think it really strengthens the weaknesses of carbon peaking by 2030 and carbon neutralization by 2050. But I feel like the United States haven't done enough of promoting this ideology of carbon neutrality. So how, as citizens ourselves, can push for those changes?
It's interesting. In the United States, most people know that climate change is a very serious crisis, and we just had the devastating fires in Hawaii to show how tragic this climate change is. We're in the hottest period in not only recorded history, but in human history for the last 125,000 years. The month of July was probably the single hottest month ever that humanity has experienced. Certainly that's true during the period of recorded temperatures. So we should be doing much more. And the American people know this. And certain things are happening, of course. There's investment in green energy in a lot of places. There's investment in the conversion of the auto industry to electric vehicles, which is part of the solution. But at the national level, there was a piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very strange name for legislation, which is mainly centered on the energy transformation, and it gives tax breaks for green energy. But what it doesn't do is make a national plan. There is no national plan. It doesn't make a national plan because in American politics, the power of the fossil fuel lobby, big oil and big coal, is so strong that politicians don't tell the truth to their own constituents, and they act on behalf of their lobbies who pay for their campaigns rather than on behalf of the American people. In the United States Senate, in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, the chairman, Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, is notorious for being the front for the big oil lobby. And he himself has family wealth tied up in 2 coal companies. So I regard that as corruption, but in the American system, it's legal corruption, or seems to be legal, but it's corruption nonetheless. If you're told that in a country that hasn't taken a clear plan for decarbonization has senior officials who own coal companies, you'd say, well, of course, that's just political corruption. But unfortunately, that's how the United States works. So the American people are saying more and more, we're disgusted with the political system. It's all about money. It's all about the reelection of these corrupt politicians. And I think that the more we clarify how broken this is, the farther we're going to get. But of course, at substantive levels, we need a plan of action to decarbonize by 2050 that is not only at the state level, because many states have such plans taking shape, but at the federal level. And one of the main lessons of what's happening right now is that there are more projects in more projects in wind and solar than can be put onto the grid, because the real breakdown is the transmission system. But that's where federal investment and a federal plan is needed. And we don't have that because of all the political problems that I talked about.
And I think that America's structure is so like money-based, money-focused, that it comes before the mutual benefits that all the human can get.
That's always exactly right.
Yeah,
it's not based on the common good. It's based on the special interest.
Right, it's always money, money, money. And then I want to touch on this, is that we all know that Japanese is going to have a nuclear wastewater dumps. So what are some actions that United Nations would do to counter this type of behavior?
Well, on the specifics on Japan, I can't really comment because I haven't studied the scientific arguments on both sides. And in general, on technical arguments, I tend to listen to the range of experts and ask their opinion. So I would think at a minimum what the UN should be doing, and maybe it is, and I'm just not involved at all in it, is looking at through the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is based in Vienna, at this question of the wastewater from Fukushima and what should be done about it, because that's a technical issue that should not be any individual government's authority. The UN should weigh in, especially at the technical level. But in general, we have some pretty clear needs that are urgent, whether it's the decarbonization or protecting the ecosystems from pollution or from over harvesting or from waste. And we need technical plans of action. But that planning mechanism is hard work. And it's hard work for the political reason of keeping it free from corruption. And it's hard work at the technical level because a lot of technical issues are raised. And so countries need effective planning ministries. China has the National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, which does a lot of the technical planning. And the United States doesn't have a planning ministry. So we don't make plans because we don't have a ministry of planning or a ministry of economy or a planning agency. In the US lexicon, planning is a bad idea. But, you know, for certain things, I am happy that planning is done within private businesses. But for other things, I want the planning to be done by government. And in every sphere of the economy, planning is essential. It's just that sometimes it's not a government function, sometimes it's a private sector function.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, the United States government needs to go through a really big structural change. And in that, I think the driving forces are the Gen Z and Gen Alpha people coming up. But right now, I think we lack guidance. So what are some advices that you would guide, like some advices that you would give us to start with?
Well, that's a really very interesting and deep question, because let me just say that our Constitution was drafted in 1787. Of course, it's had some amendments since then, but basically it's the same structure that was decided in 1787. And it's out of date. It doesn't have the substantive principles that are needed for the modern period, and it does not enable the strong planning or environmental protection or assurance of economic rights for the people. So it's really an out-of-date structure in many, many ways. At the same time, it has been deeply damaged by corruption, by the money in the politics. So I would make many changes, but I think the idea should be that sustainable development, that means an economy that works for the common good and that protects the environment and that provides the public services that anyone needs, whether it's health or education, that these are part of the citizens' rights and responsibilities, and that the government has the effective means to carry that out without the corruption of private money in politics is central. And I think, as you say, today's young people are going to really need to fix the US system, because otherwise it's just going to continue to be in decline.
And yeah, I think currently another problem with the US is that it's basically Red Scare Volume 2. Like the counter propaganda against China is like, oh, China is bad to all the young people. So that creates a really unhealthy into their mindset about a prejudice about China and unwilling to learn about these different type of political systems that might have some policies that could be used in the United States.
So, excellent point. Basically, there are a lot of lies about a lot of things in politics in the United States. Because if you have a system that's based on special interests, the special interests try to hide. They want their benefits without saying, you see, I run the government. So we have a set of falsehoods that keep clarity at a distance, actually.
Yeah.
And so it takes some effort, but as you say, the anti-China propaganda is really heavy and very intense right now by people who know nothing about China or its history or its economic successes in the last 40 years or the hard work of the people.
Right. And how do we counter those misinformation?
I think we have first any lies need to be called out. So I try to do that on a daily basis and through articles and books and speeches. But I think it's also important that young people make direct contacts and use the digital connections across schools. So University of Michigan and Tsinghua University, working together, discussing, and so forth. Somehow making such projects, both the economic, cultural, business, technological, I think would be a big help. But our government is really aiming to, as you say, scare people rather than to really educate them.
Yeah, and the penultimate question is, where do you see the economy, the world economy, in sustainable development ways to achieve in 5 to 10 years?
The good sign is that we have so much new good technology, 5G, low-cost renewable energy, robotics, many new approaches to problem solving. We really could make the energy transformation to safe energy at low cost. And this is the most important point. Use our knowledge and deploy it at scale. But the challenge is conflict, division, vested interests, greed that impedes us from using these solutions at scale. So it's not even possible to predict the future with any insight, because we could have a good future with big solutions, or we could have a very broken, divided, dangerous future, and we have to fight for the good one. And that's why this is more of a question of effort than prediction.
Yeah. So last of all, so what is one message that you will want to share with all the young viewers that are aspiring to be, great economists and entrepreneurs?
Well, go be the best you can, but serve the common good as you do it. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are in an interconnected world. We need global problem solving. We need friendships across nations. All this talk of war and conflict and division is extremely dangerous and completely unnecessary. And so go be champions of sustainable development, use new technologies, be great entrepreneurs, but always do it in a peaceful and cooperative mindset, not doing it because we have to beat the other side, but because it's good for the world.
Thank you very much. We will start with the questions, if I may, right away. You have experienced a lot. You are one of the most famous scholars in the world, and you have witnessed many serious events, being the war in Vietnam, the collapse of the Soviet Union, invasion of the United States and its allies in Iraq, Afghanistan. However, today, often we hear that the situation at the moment is actually the most serious as it was, the most threatening as it was after the Second World War. Do you share this opinion?
We certainly have really grave dangers. We also have good solutions to these if we keep our head on and if we're honest about the situation. Of course, there have been moments of absolutely immediate peril. I think back 61 years, and I remember it actually, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were just within a moment of nuclear war, and it was only extraordinarily wise leadership by President Kennedy and by Nikita Khrushchev that pulled the two countries back from the brink of complete disaster for the world. We're not standing at the edge exactly that way, but boy, are we creating risks like the war in Ukraine, which is really a war between the United States and Russia. Though it's being fought in Ukraine by Ukrainians, it's a proxy war. And now this war in Gaza, which is a war fought by Israel, but made possible by the United States and is extremely dangerous. And the high tensions between the United States and China, which, again, I blame the United States for as the main reason. Add those up, it's a bad situation. But then add on top of that the fact that we have the man-made dangers of environmental destruction, climate change, pollution, destruction of our fisheries and our forests, that is very serious, very far along, and even denied by many political leaders. We still have political leaders who are scientifically ignorant, who aggressively deny what is absolutely facing us, which is terrible destabilization of the physical systems for our food supplies, our forests, our fisheries, and so forth. So you add this all up, it's a terribly difficult and bad time. And maybe what makes everyone so nervous on top of it is that the quality of political leadership is extremely low. Our president is 81 years old and should be in retirement. This is absolutely obvious. Our Congress is quite corrupt in the United States because we have a system of campaign financing that depends on billions and billions of dollars going from big companies to the congressmen and senators. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. There's a great deal of instability, and our political leaders don't know how to get along with each other. So you add this all up, it's definitely bad. Whether it's absolutely the worst, it's a little hard to judge, but it's bad enough that we ought to do something about it.
You actually mentioned many questions that I was going to ask, but if I understand correctly, how did we get there actually? So definitely there is some kind of crisis of leadership, because I believe that the problem is not only a senior American president, these problems can be also in other countries. Then, of course, there's a concentration of unprecedented crises. And of course, there is a part, I would say, that's considering the decisions that the superpowers make. Would you agree with this combination?
I think if I could put one word on the reason we're in this crisis, it is arrogance. Arrogance of the rich and the powerful. And the United States was the richest and the most powerful of all during this period. So the arrogance of the United States has been extremely notable. You know, when the Cold War ended in 1989 in Central Europe and in 1991 in the former Soviet Union, we might have said, now we have a glorious opportunity for peace,
for cooperation, and for prosperity. This didn't happen. It could have happened. I was there. I saw what could have been done. Instead, the United States said, we won, we're the best, we're the most powerful, we don't have to deal with anybody except on our own terms. And the United States absolutely went from arrogant to hyper arrogant and said, we can do what we want, where we want. And strangely enough, though the United States basically faced no security threats after that time, it went to war more often than ever. Of course, it completely misjudged two things. One, it continued to think of Russia as a natural enemy, and so it actually created a new enemy, because I was advisor to Gorbachev, I was advisor to Yeltsin. They wanted absolute peace and normal relations. There's no doubt in my mind. This wasn't a trick. It wasn't a plot. It was an attempt to create normal relations. The United States instead said, oh, no, we won. Now we'll move NATO. Okay, Hungary, Czech Republic, Poland. Oh, we'll keep moving. We'll go to the Baltics. We'll go to Romania, Bulgaria. We'll go to the Balkans. Oh, no. We'll go to Ukraine. We'll go to Georgia. We'll surround Russia. We'll decolonize Russia. That's a term used in American political circles. Even saying, oh, Russia should be dismembered now. Well, what on earth are these people thinking? Russia has 6,000 nuclear warheads, a powerful army, a self-respect, and a desire for its own security. And so the United States provoked what absolutely it should not have provoked. So this was a part of the issue. A second part of the issue is that, in general, the rich became arrogant in a different way, saying, oh, we're so good. We used to be millionaires. Now we're billionaires. We don't have to share anything. So they became libertarian in philosophy. Libertarian in American philosophy means we don't have to pay taxes because what we have is ours and nobody's going to take it away. And so we developed a super rich class that became very self-righteous. That's my money. It's nobody else's money. How dare the government think to take it? And at the same time, a growing amount of people struggling in poverty or losing jobs to technology, being replaced by robots, being replaced by automation. So the gap in our society between the rich and the poor widened considerably. And this was the second factor. And you would think that in a political democracy, the poor people would vote out the ones that are leaning on them, or would vote for tax increases on the small group of very powerful. But that theory is wrong, because the small group of very powerful buy the politicians. They really do. And so they pay the campaign contributions. And the first rule of the US Congress is vote tax cuts for companies and rich individuals. So that is the second thing that happened. The third thing that happened is that the environmental crises, especially the climate change crisis, came and would require changes in our behavior and would also cause limitations to the big energy industry, the oil, the gas, the coal industry. And the industry resisted those changes, said no. And the politicians said, oh, it's not even real. Like Václav Klaus and others, they just denied the climate change. And this denial has gone on for decades.
Actually, we just saw a new president of Argentina elected just now, who said that climate change is a socialist plot. You can't even make this up. I don't know whether this is just playing games to get elected, whether it's complete sheer ignorance, whether it's corruption. I don't know what it is, but it's shocking. People in any kind of responsibility should know better. They should at least understand what this issue is about. And this has been a very big challenge. It's, again, part of the arrogance. I happen to lead a scientific institute at Columbia University with hundreds of climate scientists. So I had an earful all the time about the climate science. Many people don't have that chance to hear directly. So they hear from politicians or actors who want to be politicians, who say whatever they feel like. And the result is that we go decade after decade without solving these problems, despite all the meetings, the treaties, the conferences, and so forth. So when you add all of this up, as I said, I think the underlying problem is arrogance of the rich and the powerful, who somehow think the rules don't apply to them. And we end up in a world that is in conflict. We end up in a world that is divided between rich and poor. We end up in a world that is facing massive environmental crises. And it's all so weird because the world's richer than ever before, better technologies than ever before. And we could, if we chose right, move to peace immediately. I just testified in the UN Security Council about 4 wars: the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel and Palestine, the war in Syria, and the war in the Sahel of Africa, which is Burkina, Mali, Chad, Niger. And I pointed out all 4 of these huge wars could be stopped tomorrow with politics, with basic sound politics. But our leaders are just incapable of basic sound politics, unfortunately.
When you mentioned arrogance and the beginning of the 90s, well, I am from the Czech Republic, as you know, myself. So,
Of course.
yes, we have vast experience with neoliberal policies and their application. However, I wanted to ask about liberal democracy. Of course, we have to mention Francis Fukuyama and his end of history. And now we see how completely wrong that was. But do you see also the liberal democracy as something that maybe hides more the true state of affairs than actually helps to resolve the conflicts? Because, when scholars like Martin Wolf suggest that maybe instead of voting, we should have some, choice by chance randomly, that would be better than elect the representatives that we have. There's certainly something wrong. So maybe if you could elaborate on the liberal democracy, and maybe it really will be an end, but the question is what kind of end it will be.
It would be great if we could make democracy work, because democracy is very attractive in principle. It's a way for free people to express themselves. It's a way for people to participate. It's a way for people to learn about social and political realities. So it, in principle, is a very attractive system. And in general, it's a way for people to have protection from their own governments, because non-democratic governments can be very, very destructive of their own people because there's no control necessarily over government. So in principle, I'm a Democrat, but in practice, you can see all of the difficulties of making this work. A democracy needs to have an informed public. A democracy needs to have a respectful dialogue or deliberation in the public, not shouting, not even worse, violence, not hidden influence. A democracy needs to prevent being taken over by powerful interests that use the democracy as a facade, as a pretense rather than real democracy. So some democracies work pretty well. Some in Europe work reasonably well. I would say the quality of the American democracy has declined tremendously during my lifetime. Maybe that's an illusion, but I feel that, and I can see even in the data that people had more confidence in government 60 years ago than they have today. And I look at that, and I've, of course, spent my whole life trying to understand that declining confidence in our government. And I find two factors that are at the core of this. One is that after World War II, the United States created a security state with the CIA and other institutions that were supposedly ensuring national security. But in fact, they really diminished democracy, because the first principle of the CIA is that it's secret and its actions are secret. And it does lots of things around the world that are not good, but they're secret. So this really undermined American democracy. And we don't have much public effect on foreign policy, for example, in the United States, because when it comes to foreign policy, really the president and a few other people make decisions on behalf of everybody without public debate or without control by any really democratic institutions, other than a vote once every few years. But that's not enough, because we go to war all the time against the interests of the American people. So that's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem that I mentioned earlier is the big money in politics. Some countries restrict private campaign financing. In fact, most in Europe don't have a lot of corruption of the political system. But the United States, I regard as kind of legal corruption, legal in the sense that our Supreme Court said that companies can spend whatever they want on politics, no restriction, or few restrictions. And the result is our election cycle, say the 2024 election, will spend maybe $15 billion of campaign financing. Now, you don't get honest government with so much money changing hands. You get government that is purchased by the highest bidder. And this is why the confidence in democracy has declined so much.
You mentioned, of course, the power of big money. I wouldn't be so optimistic about the situation in Europe. I just believe because the economies are weaker, then there's not so much money as in the US, but the tendency is practically the same. You mentioned Joe Biden and, of course, then President Trump. Probably they'll meet in elections next year, probably. Do you see the crisis in leadership? Because when we look in the past, we see many strong leaders who were both from Europe, from the United States, who were able to offer some vision and lead a society, some of them even towards a peaceful society. We mentioned Willy Brandt, Olof Palme. We can also mention Ronald Reagan as a special type of American heritage as well. I would say there is a certain decline in these leadership qualities. Do you view it as well? Because in Europe, it's, I think, very visible.
Yes, I think the quality of the political leadership in the US and Europe is very weak right now in general. Speaking of the United States, we have two
leading candidates, one of whom is 81 and can't find his way off the stage anymore. He happens to be our president. And the other one is a convicted, is multiply convicted, psychologically unstable person who now faces dozens of criminal counts right now in trials coming up. So maybe we'll have an octogenarian who should never be running, and a convicted felon running for the presidency. This is a terrible, terrible thing, obviously. How can we get there? There are some other candidates. I'm hoping that Robert Kennedy Jr. Proves himself as a highly capable candidate, and I like him. We were schoolmates, we're friends, and he comes from a great political tradition. In fact, his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was, in my view, the last great American president, because after that, well, we had some very nice and smart people, a few, not very many. Jimmy Carter was one. But we've had a lot of failed presidents and failed presidencies. So the quality of leadership is quite low. And in Europe, it's also really surprising to me how, when the United States makes such bad judgments, European leaders tend to follow along the US lead. And of course, I'm very unhappy about the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone's unhappy about it, but I have a view that's somewhat different from the mainstream view, which is, in my interpretation, the war in Ukraine was caused by the US wanting to expand NATO. And of course, many in Europe say, no, it's all Putin. He did this. But I know enough history, and I was present at enough events to know how much the US provoked this war through absolutely stupid policies. Because if you're smart, you don't push a military alliance right up against Russia's border. That's just not a wise thing to do. Russia's extremely sensitive to the military of the West encroaching on it because of how many times Russia's been invaded by the West. And especially when the United States politicians have so much hostility to Russia, which they do. They openly express the idea that Russia should be dismantled and many other things. Of course, Russia's going to see NATO expansion as a direct threat to national security, and it's not going to let it happen. So this is just an example of terrible policy, predictable disaster. But the US went along with it. Now, my point was, the Europeans knew better. I know, because many Europeans told me many times, oh, NATO expansion to Ukraine is very dangerous. But then they don't say it in public. And they don't say it in public because the United States would get mad at them. And, they're afraid of the US. They shouldn't be afraid of the US. Europe should have its own independent foreign policy, and it should understand its own interests. And the interests are not just following along the United States. So this is just a very important example of the weakness of the political leadership right now in Europe as well as in the United States.
Yeah, we see that here very well. So they're actually not able even to formulate the national interests. And I don't know if it's fear or simply they are not capable to understand what's going on. Maybe it's a combination of both. However, the consequences are really disastrous for the EU, both economically and politically, of course. You mentioned
one European political leader said to me a couple of years ago, oh, they don't take us seriously in Washington. And he said it even more colorfully, which I won't repeat exactly, but
this was a leader of a major country. And my thought was, yeah, but you should not allow yourself to be treated that way. That's your fault. That's not America's fault. Yes, America's arrogant, but stand up for Europe. And this should be the approach, but it's not the approach. Because I think we've covered a lot of ground for ASEAN, and we've heard a lot of things that are very promising. And that's good, because we need some optimism and some direction for how to overcome some of the big challenges right now. If we were to step back from our crises and look at some of the very fundamental trends in the world, we'd have a great deal of reason for optimism, in fact. The world economy and world society as a whole has become much better off than it was 100 years ago, without question. Life expectancy has risen remarkably. Income in the world, on average, is now $20,000 per person if measured at international prices, and about $12,000 per person if measured at market prices. And this is a huge rise of incomes and well-being and quality of diets, protection of healthcare coverage, and many, many other really fundamental parts of our material life. And what Dr. Zhao described for China, which is absolutely incredible, for 1.4 billion people over a period of 40 years, has been achieved not quite at that pace, but very broadly in many parts of the world. And the underlying reason for those improvements is that science, technology, know-how has advanced and continues to advance even at an accelerating rate. So our ability to address practical challenges is really unprecedented right now. Our wealth is unprecedented, and our know-how is unprecedented. This is really the fundamental reason for being very optimistic about what we can do and what we should do in the coming years. What we've learned, though, is that there are at least three fundamental problems with the way the world functions. And that's what brings us to this workshop and what brings us to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first is that with all that progress, there are billions of people that have been effectively left behind this progress, that are really struggling for a variety of reasons. People live in more remote areas or in very unfavorable geographies, or are part of minority groups that have been maltreated within societies, or half the population, women and girls, that traditionally were not part of the market economy, were part of the household economy, and have definitely seen progress, but facing a lot of social obstacles still today, which is why one of the Sustainable Development Goals is directed specifically at the issues of gender, SDG 5. So one of the three huge challenges is that we have a rich world and a lot of very poor and suffering people within that world. And that's just, I think for most of us, humanly unacceptable. And indeed, when the UN was established in 1948, all of the member states agreed that there should be basic standards of life for every person on the planet because they're people on the planet, because they're human beings, and the world is productive enough to ensure the dignity of everybody. And that's why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And I regard us still trying to honor that declaration, which seems to me to be the basic point. So problem number one is the very uneven development, the fact that there is still today a significant part of the world that lives in really abject deprivation. And that's a first challenge. And I think it's ethically probably the number one challenge, because extreme deprivation in a world of plenty is absolutely destructive of all of our humanity if we don't solve that problem. So that's why SDG 1 is end extreme poverty. Straightforward. And SDG 2, the second highest priority, is end hunger, for heaven's sake. Of course, there are big challenges of how to do it, but I will say in a world of wealth and knowledge, this is definitely within reach. It's crazy, to my mind, that if the average income is $12,000 per capita, there are people living at a few $100s per capita, and the world just goes on as they suffer and die young and face terrible hardships. The second big challenge, the huge challenge, the puzzle that is even harder than the first one conceptually, is that we discovered about 50 years ago that the nature of our economic development, all that wealth that I just talked about, is environmentally destructive, because the much vaunted economic processes don't take care of their physical byproducts. And some of them were not understood till 50 or 100 years ago, like greenhouse gases and their effects on climate. That required a scientific breakthrough of a quite deep order to understand that. It came by the end of the 19th century, and then it took at least 75 years to create measurement systems to verify the science. And we've more or less known from around 1980 that humanity is really changing the climate in ways that could be dangerous. And we're still struggling with that fact, because what brought us that wealth in the first place, starting in the 1800s, was fossil fuels. And then we discovered about halfway through, oh, those are dangerous. That's not good. So this is the second big problem, is that we have an economic system and a set of laws, rules, regulations, a global commons, the open seas, and many other factors of our economic system that mean that the scale of production is now self-destructive. And as I say, we've understood this intellectually at least for about 50 years. It was 50 years ago that the first conference on this fact took hold. It was 51 years ago that the first good book about this, Limits to Growth, was written and made clear that there was a real problem. And we've not finished solving that problem. But let me stipulate the following, just like I did for the first one. There's nothing fundamental about these environmental challenges that is beyond our solution, even with our current knowledge base. In other words, we already in 2023 have the range of technical solutions to 90% of the greenhouse gases. not 100%. We definitely don't face a choice between food and nature. We face a choice between destructive and non-destructive forms of food production. That's a very different choice. I haven't found in 40 years of my work on this a fundamental barrier to economic well-being and environmental sustainability. So I'm not in the degrowth school of thought, which says that what we really need is to reverse economic development. Not all economic development is good for human well-being. That's a different matter. But I'm not of the school of thought that says we've created a kind of society that is completely inconsistent with our environmental necessities or our environmental well-being or health. What we have is a very flawed economic system, legal system, regulatory system, incentive structure, so that we adopt or continue with technologies that are very ill-advised and do lots of stupid things because it's possible to make money off of those stupid things, rather than do the things that we should be doing. And I've not seen in all of my experience any calculations that show me that that doing the right things is beyond our reach, beyond our budget, beyond our economic means. For example, all of the estimates about the energy transformation to a zero carbon energy system suggest that it's 1 or 2% of world output that is needed to make that change. That's really strange. It's not that it's 50% of world output that's needed. It's not that this is cataclysmically expensive and we're just doomed as if an asteroid were coming to hit the planet and we have nothing to do. No, we have clear, very, very clear things to do. Sometimes we have too many possible things to do, so we don't know which one to take, so we're paralyzed. Should we do wind or solar or nuclear or this? I don't know. We won't do anything right now. We're making money with what we're doing. So we're paralyzed, or we know what to do, but there are strong vested interests saying don't do it because I'm making too much money in the short term doing the destructive things, or it just is complicated and hasn't been thought out properly because this is something absolutely new. It was rather straightforward to build a coal plant, but it's not so straightforward perhaps to build offshore wind or solar fields or something else because of storage or other issues. So there are just complexities. But that's the second big category of challenge that we face, which is this economic environmental collision course, which again needs analysis and then needs to ask, how deep is the problem? And for me, and how solvable is the problem? So the climate crisis is very deep, but it's also rather solvable. And there are some puzzles, definitely. What should big ocean tankers run on? Should it be hydrogen fuel cells? Should it be ammonia? Should it be hydrogen combustion? I'm not an engineer. I've heard the arguments from the engineers. I want them to fight it out. I want them to try different approaches, but clearly we should be trying these technology lines. The third big challenge, which is a challenge of time immemorial, is that we seem to have a very hard time to stop killing each other. So war, becomes ever more dangerous because the weapons become ever more destructive. And now we're technologically so smart that we figured out how to destroy the whole humanity. Damn it. If we weren't so smart, we wouldn't have this trouble. But a few geniuses figured out you could make nuclear fission work to make a bomb. By the way, there were probably 50 people in the world that understood that. And they figured it out, and then they gave it to a world of idiots. So we have a lot of dumb people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, and they were made by a few geniuses. That's our problem. So this is our third issue, which is how to stay peaceful and cooperative. To my mind, these are the three big issues that we face, which is how to be fair and decent to people who are suffering, how to make sure that we're not self-destructive because our economic system is actually a complicated set of incentives that doesn't get things right, and there's no magic in how we have organized our economic life to handle issues like greenhouse gases, which weren't in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations and are not part of the things that a free market can solve, and so forth. And the third is this interminable problem that if you read human history, we've been fighting with each other most of the time, but there are also glimmers of hope that there are long periods of peace, and we also have institutions for peace just like we have institutions for war. One of the things that makes me quite optimistic about China's rise is that China has been much more peaceful in its history than just about any other region of the world. And the amount of interstate war of China over the last 2,000 years is actually quite low. It's basically been wars of pastoralists coming from the north and sedentary farmers trying to fight them off. And that's been most of China's wars for 2,000 years. If you look at Europe's wars, it was just kill each other across the divide for 1,000 years, nonstop. So China at least has a peaceful tradition, and I think it fits actually with this idea of harmonious society, with the idea of global civilizations and so forth. I'm quite an optimist, I have to say, about that, because I think it actually there's a deep rootedness. So that's all we have to do. End poverty, protect the environment, stop killing with each other. All right? So, thank you. No, okay. So what do we do? To my mind, the basic thing is we should think hard about each of those things and then come up with plans. That's the most basic idea. That sounds so dumb. Why am I saying that after 40 years? Don't I have anything more intelligent to say? And the thing is that the way that our social systems work is not to think and then solve these things. And that's very interesting. Our economic system is designed around a different principle, which is let people do what they want, get rich, go find your job, go buy what you want, but not solve problems. So in economic land, it's not oriented towards solving problems. It's oriented towards doing your thing. Businesses are supposed to go make profits, and we're supposed to be good consumers, and we're supposed to be smart in the job that we pursue. But at least in market economics, which became the dominant ideology
of the Anglo-Saxon world and then the world, it isn't to solve problems, it's go do your thing. So don't expect the answers to these problems to come from the economic sphere or from the business community. It's not their job. Their job is to run a business, it's to make money. So that's problem number one, that we don't think in the economic sphere about end goals. We're supposed to just do our thing. And then politicians. In most politics, it's not about solving problems. It's about maintaining power. And that's even the goal. And you have experts on maintaining power. All the politicians have little Machiavellis around them, handing them, this is what you need to do to stay in power. And that's your goal. And so politics, at least in my country, has very little to do with any goals. I don't know what any American goals are. We have no goals. We have some heroes, our founding fathers. We love the Constitution. We like the July 4th Independence Day, but we have no goals. And even when I hear Dr. Zhao talk about China's goals, you could not have that in the United States, stating those goals, because that's socialism. You're not allowed to have goals. So politics is not oriented towards solving problems. Really, it's management of power, competition for power, holding on to power, benefiting from power. And so we don't see from our governments most of the time these big goals and how to solve them. I really think China's been different in this period, the last 40 years, from most other governments. And I think the success is a result of that, actually, that it's really, and why? Well, I think this is a very interesting question, but a few countries at a few times have very clear goals. Maybe because of survival, maybe because of their past history, maybe because they have a successful neighbor, so they want to imitate the success. Maybe, like in Singapore, because a genius came, Lee Kuan Yew, and he had a very, very clear idea. And really, Singapore, it is a case of a very clear, brilliant thinker who just guided things for quite a while, like Plato's philosopher king. But most of the time, this is not how politics is. So we don't see a lot of this problem solving coming from governments. And the third thing is, in my country, which became the most powerful country in the world for the last 75 years militarily, they really think that fighting wars is a big part of what governance is about. They're crazy and dangerous and could get us all killed. So that third category of just peaceful cooperation does not come easily. Every day we read something hateful about China in the American newspapers now. Every single day. I just read today, China has the Global Civilizations Initiative. Wonderful. You talked about it. Today I just read, this is terrible. This is, China's out to take over the world through this. Now, honestly, this is a mindset that is very, very deep, probably ingrained evolutionarily in us also, because there probably was a time when whoever could control the next water hole survived, and whoever didn't survive, and it was us or them.
And that's not how the world is right now. It's not us or them. We don't need to take over any other place to have well-being, period. There's no crisis of living room. There is only the crisis of understanding, don't kill the other side. Okay, so what do? Again, just to conclude, we need to think clearly. Excuse me. That's a technical term about American politics. So we need really to put serious ideas forward in detail. And that's the purpose of what we're after. And two specific pathways that we're really focusing on right now is one is the energy transition, because there's only a quarter century and an energy system's really complicated. You have to have a power grid. We have to convert all the vehicles to electric or to hydrogen or to some other non-emitting source. The building sector has to be far more efficient. Industry emits a lot of greenhouse gases, deforestation. In other words, all of the getting to net zero is quite a complicated challenge with lots of moving parts, and it's a lot of money. Not more than an energy system costs, but an energy system is trillions of dollars a year, and so it's worth getting right. So that's the first of the pathways. And the second is the land use and ocean use, because we're really so close to destroying everything irreversibly. When the species is lost, it's never coming back. And when the ecosystems are degraded, many of them never return. And if we pass climate thresholds, we're just going to spend the next century in disaster of calamitous sea level rises, storms, heat waves, and so on. So we're very close to that. So those are the two main pathways that we are really focusing on: the biological and its association with food production and with other agricultural production. And for this region, that's central, because this is a biodiversity Garden of Eden, and also a biodiversity threatened region intensively. All this beauty, and it's being torn down. And it can happen so fast because economies are very, very large right now, and demands. China could deforest this country just by its demands for tropical hardwoods without a problem, unless you take care. So those are the two areas that we really want to focus on. And the final point that I want to say is, again, about this third category of cooperation. It happens that when you look technically at an energy program or at an ecosystem program, no country can do this by itself. Nothing can be done other than at the local level, but plans need to be transnational without question. So there's a lot of local action, but they have to be part of a broader framework. And that's why this is an ASEAN workshop, because ASEAN countries are not only together on the map and not only physical neighbors, but have work to do together, because ASEAN countries cannot achieve their goals without working together. And so we need to do this at a transnational planning level. That's hard, because there are no elected transnational officials anywhere. All transnational organizations are weak, because none of them has an army. None of them has political leaders were organized at the national level in the world. That's where the physical force lies. And that's where the politics generally lies. And yet we have global and regional problems that need addressing urgently. The Mekong is not going to be saved one country at a time. It's going to be saved by China, Laos, PDR, Cambodia, Vietnam working together. Without question, there's no way to do that one country at a time. It's got to be done in the watershed. The energy system for Malaysia absolutely needs to be integrated with the rest of the region. And those regional institutions are weak politically and organizationally, and they need to be strengthened considerably. And then the question of what region is the right region for this. We're dealing with ASEAN because it's a crucial, established regional entity. But I said yesterday, and I'll say it again, I think for the energy sector, RCEP is even more appropriate. That's adding in ASEAN plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The United States would have a fit, by the way. I'll be done in 1 minute. The US would have a fit. You're cooperating with China? Well, my strong advice to you is cooperate with China closely. And my strong advice to Australia is don't build a submarine base, cooperate with China. And let's not waste money on nuclear submarines right now and raise the tension more. So my own advice is that broader group, and I hope India joins that group, and then we've got a lot of the world together in a way that could actually solve the problems. So sorry for the long rambling, except I believe that all of these problems are solvable. I believe that universities have a unique and extremely important role to play in this, because this is what we should be doing: training, teaching, educating, researching, policy analysis, and really trying to make politics work the way that it should, which is for the common good. Thank you.